Hey guys, it's Rogaway here, and I'm back with another tutorial, and today I am going to be showing you guys how to use Blender to apply materials and textures to objects. So let's get right into it. Let's go to Blender and let's start a new scene. There we go. And basically the reason you'd want to add materials and textures is to give your objects more recognizable materials that we would, understand or recognize from the real world. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the basic cube by hitting X and delete, get rid of that. And I'm going to go over to create here, and I'm going to create a plane. And a plane is basically just a flat ground type object. And I'm just going to place that. I'm going to hit S to scale it up. I'm going to make a nice ground plane that will just kind of sit in our scene. And then I'm also going to create a UV sphere, and I'm going to just hit G to move that, and Z along the Z axis. That's good. I'm going to scale it down a bit, something like that. I'm going to just move that back down a little. And then I'm also going to go over to tools here and just set it to smooth so everything looks nice. And there we go. That's our starting point right there. Alright, now basically the first thing we'll go over here is materials, and materials are really important because materials kind of set the base for what our objects are going to look like as far as the color go and the properties of the object itself. So if I take this circle, if I have this circle selected and I go over here to this side and I go to the material tab, I'm going to be able to click new material. And that is going to allow me to have all the options for how this material is going to look in the world. And you can see here it's showing it as a sphere exactly as it is, but you could switch between different types of objects to see how they would look with that same material applied. Alright, so there we go. Now I'm going to go through some of these. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm going to go through some. I'll try to explain as best as I can what each one does. Basically the first one here is diffuse, and diffuse is the color, the base color of this object. So if we click diffuse and we click this color right here, we can set the object to whatever color we want. Okay, so let's say I want this sphere to be red. That's the diffuse color of it. I can change the intensity of the red right here. Okay, it's kind of like a saturation slider, and I can get a preview of what that's going to look like right here. The next one is specular, and specular is the color of this. This is called the specular highlight right there. So if I want the specular highlight to be a different color, let's say, than white, say I want it to be pink, that becomes pink. I'm going to leave it at the default white, and there it is. Alright, now the intensity of that highlight, you'll notice that if I slide this, I can make it brighter or darker depending on the type of material. Some materials, like let's say rubber for example, is going to have a very low intensity on the specular. Alright, whereas some objects that are really reflective and shiny are going to have a brighter specular highlight. Now the next one here with hardness determines how soft this specular highlight actually is. So I'll show you what I mean. If I crank this, that specular highlight will become very small and focused, and if I bring it down, that specular highlight is going to become very gigantic and soft. Alright, so again, that lets us have a little more control over how that material looks when lights are reflecting off of it. Okay, this one here under shading is basically how dark the shadows are, but you can kind of make self-emitting objects, things that look like they're glowing from the inside. So you can increase that. You'll see that the object almost becomes like a light bulb. You can tell it to be shadeless so that it doesn't have any shade. It becomes just a flat color. So I don't use this very often, but if you want something to look like it's glowing, you can use that as well. There's better options for that. The next one is transparency, and this one's kind of cool because what you can do is when you turn on transparency, this little checkbox here, you got 3 different ways to make transparency in Blender. I'm going to just use Z transparency because it's really quick and easy and it renders fast. But watch the object right here, okay? So under alpha, if I start pulling this down, you will see that the object starts to go transparent. We can see through it. However, over on this side, you don't see that happening. All right, that's because we are in solid view. Okay, we're in solid 3D view, which means that all the objects look solid in this view, regardless of their material that they have. All right, so you can see that when I look at it here, it looks proper, but over here it looks solid. All right, so that is cool. That allows us to make clear objects. So if we're making a liquid or we're making glass or something, we're going to use the alpha slider. All right. The next one is mirror, and mirror actually gives us, actually I do want to show one other thing. Because this is another interesting feature. With Z transparency, you can do your alpha. It's really quick, it's really easy and basic. But if you go to ray trace, you can do much more advanced transparency. So this one thing I'm going to show you, I'm not going to show you the rest of the features because they're kind of advanced, but this IOR stands for index of refraction. So if you look right now, this object has the background showing through it perfectly, but that's not realistic because in the real world, if you had a sphere that was reflecting something through it, this would get distorted. The index of refraction is what controls that. So if I click here and I put, let's say, 1.33, you'll notice how that background becomes distorted through that material. If I put 1.5, you can see how that object is now distorting the background rather than just showing it perfectly through. All right, so this ray tracing gives you more control over how this material is going to look and how it's going to refract the light through that object. The next one is a mirror, and this is a really good one. In here you can set the reflection of this object. So right now it's at 0. And this is basically how many times it's going to be able to reflect the objects around it. So if I go and I start cranking this, you're going to see that that changes how reflective this object is. So it is reflecting this checker box room around Earth in the object. You can see how intense your reflection can become. If you go all the way, it basically becomes like chrome and it reflects everything. Or you can just go a little bit to get kind of a subtle effect on that. Now remember, if you don't use transparency, for example, then it just becomes a reflective sort of material, like a really polished plastic or something. So you can turn off or use whatever you want here. This one here, depth, is how many times it's going to reflect the materials around it. So let's say you had a mirror and you had an object sitting next to the mirror and they were reflecting one another. Right now we have it set to reflect 2 times. The more you increase this, the slower it's going to make the rendering time, so I would keep it low while you're testing. Alright, I'm going to skip these 2 and I'm going to go all the way down to shadow, because shadow is important. You want to make sure that it is receiving shadows and casting shadows. That is important. Alright, and I'm going to show you how this looks in a second over on this side. But basically, you can control whether this object actually even, gives shadows to other objects or receives shadows from other objects. And again, that might be something you want to use for your scene. Up at the top here, we have a few different options. I probably should have talked about this first, but we've got a surfaced object. We got a wireframe. Sorry, not object, material. You can make a surface material like what we made here. You can make a wireframe material, which basically shows you the wires, the wireframe when you go to render. You got a volume material, okay? So this would be something like, I can show you. It's kind of like, it could be a gas or some material that has volume. Under halo, you've got kind of like this light type object. Okay, so these are different types of materials. I'm going to stick with surface though. And now I want to show you guys how to actually see this so that it looks like this. All right, down at the bottom here where we've been setting our view, we've got some basic views like wireframe and solid. However, let's say we want to actually see this material as it would look in the scene. We can switch to rendered view. And rendered view is going to give us kind of a preview of what this scene looks like when it's rendered at the end. And so this is just a very quick sort of idea of what it's going to look like once it is rendered out. All right, so we can see what that material looks like. We can see what the scene looks like if it was to be rendered. Right now, you'll notice that this object below this shadow is not correct, because if this was a transparent object, this shadow wouldn't be pitch black. It would be somewhat transparent. All right, so what we can do is we can right-click this plane, and by the way, you can work in rendered view if you really want, and we'll make a new material for the plane, and I'm just going to give it a quick diffuse color of, let's say, yellow, just to show you guys how that looks with a bit of a change. You'll notice that all the reflections update. But here's what you're going to have to do. If you have a transparent object above another object, you have to go down to that same shadows tab, and you will have to tell it to receive transparent shadows. Okay, and what that will do is it will allow it to give you a more accurate shadow. It'll allow you to give you a shadow that has transparency in it. So again, if we have a light source coming from up here and this is refracting the light, it's going to create this little focus point in the shadow, which is more accurate than it was before. Okay, and keep in mind that the rendered view just does a real quick sort of preview of, you know, what that's going to look like. All right, so you can see how that looks. All right, okay, next. So that is materials, and materials are super important. Obviously, they make things look, like I said, like actual materials that we recognize from the world that we live in. The second half to this is textures, and you always should apply a base material to your object first, and I don't even know if you can do it without applying a base material first. But basically, you want to create a base material for your object, like we have on the plane, for example. Then we go over to texture. Now, texture is where we can use actual images from the real world to make objects look exactly as they should compared to real life things. So let me show you what I mean. If I click new here, I can use an image to apply to this plane instead of just a flat plain color. So down here under the image tab, I'm going to go to open, and I'm going to go to my tutorial folder, and I'm going to look for the wood JPEG. I'm going to open that up. And there you go. You can see that it has applied the wood picture across the entire plane. Now, you'll notice this strange sort of like diagonal line here. And this is something called UV mapping, which we're not going to get too much into in this particular video, maybe in a later one. But UV mapping is how your objects get textures applied to them. So how does the image wrap on this object? So what we'll do is, with the plane still selected, I'm going to scroll down to the mapping area, and you'll see that right now the coordinates for the mapping are set to UV. We're going to change that to generated just to make it easy on ourselves. And now you'll see that that image has gone across that object in a very nice even way, a single image across the entire plane. All right, it still looks really fake. It doesn't look very good, but we're going to fix that up in a sec. Let's say we wanted multiple copies of this same picture across the plane. What we could do is under size, for the Y in this case, if we set that to 3, what it'll do is it'll have 3 copies of the picture across that plane. We can go as much as we want. You know, if we go 10, now this material is becoming very small, or sorry, this texture is becoming very small because it's tiling it more across that object. Okay, we could also do the Z, so this way, if we really want, but I'm going to just set it to 1. I'm going to leave it fairly obvious as to what it is. By the way, you can see how nice this material is being reflected in the sphere now that we have an actual texture on that object. Alright, like I said, this is still looking really bad. It's looking fake. We got this, it looks very flat. It almost looks like a printout of wood. It doesn't look like real wood. It just looks completely textureless, basically. One thing you should always set before you put your picture on is the proper material settings. So if I go back to my material, alright, you'll now see that the material has the wood on it. What I like to do is set my specular to the proper intensity and hardness. So wood, for example, is going to have, at least this type of wood, if it was like a laminate, it's going to have a very high hardness. So this specular is going to become very small. I would actually bring down the intensity of it a bit, something like that. Okay, because it is a hard material. Now you can see that that reflections become really small. I don't think it would be reflective, but it would be kind of cool to see that if I brought up my reflection a little bit. Maybe not. Maybe not. We'll turn that off. I don't want to make it slow down too much. Okay, so that looks good. All these other things like transparency, mirror, the cast and receive shadows, that should all be set right. You can change them if you wanted to, but in this case we're just going to leave it like that. The only thing I wanted to change was the specular. The diffuse color is not going to show because basically the diffuse has been replaced with the image map, so you don't have to worry about changing that too much. However, the intensity of the image will be able to be used, so I could change how bright that picture is on that object by using intensity. Going back to texture now, we want this material to, or this texture to look like it actually has some sort of texture to it. Alright, we want it to actually look like wood. So what we can do is below mapping, where we were before, you're going to see this area called influence. And influence is how this texture influences the scene around it. And the most important one in here is geometry, in my opinion. You could use you can experiment with the other ones, but geometry is really important. Inside here, the very first one called normals will take the contrast values, the dark and light areas from this image and create raised or lowered areas based on the picture that has been placed on the plane. So let me show you what that means. If I turn on normals, what it has done is it has looked for the dark and light areas, and it has actually created a texture based on those color values. By default it goes to 1, which is way too much. So let's click there and let's put instead 0.1. And now you will see that that is just very subtle. We can even go smaller than that if we wanted. But now you can see that the wood doesn't look flat. If I zoom in on the wood, like this, you will now see that the wood has texture to it. It has actual, it's like you can imagine how that would feel, right? And this is a really easy way, using normals, it's an easy way to make geometry that looks way more advanced than it actually is. All right, it didn't change the fact that this plane is only, you know, go to wireframe, it's only 4 points, it's a single face. It didn't change that. Instead, all it did is change how it's rendered with the texture across it. All right, and that's going to save tons of time on rendering. All right, rather than making a piece of wood that has all those little lines and knots and all that with actual geometry, this instead will fake it by applying it to the texture that's on the object instead, which saves tons of time on rendering. All right, so that's the basics of materials and textures. I'm going to probably have a part 2, which will go into a little bit more advanced materials and textures and some of the cool things you can do, especially with UV wrapping. However, that should be enough to get you started and get you going with the materials in Blender. It's a great program, it's free, and it's really, really powerful. Thanks for watching.